The scene begins with a woman out for a jog who spots a doll lying on the ground. When she stoops to pick it up, she is brutally attacked by a wolf-like creature. The narrative then introduces two detectives, Nick Burkhardt and Hank Griffin, who are monitoring women in the vicinity. Suddenly, Nick witnesses one of them morph into a grotesque figure, leaving him bewildered and questioning whether the vision was real or a hallucination. Later, Nick and Hank arrive at the crime scene to conduct their investigation, where Nick discovers the victim's iPod, which is still playing the song Sweet Dreams. That night, Nick returns to his home and is greeted by his Aunt Marie, the woman who raised him after his parents passed away. As they are speaking outside, their conversation is violently interrupted by an attack from a monstrous creature. Nick successfully shoots and kills the assailant, which then reverts to its human form. Aunt Marie, wounded in the struggle, reveals a startling secret. His parents' death was not an accident but a murder. She then entrusts Nick with an ancient key, insisting he must protect it. At the hospital, a conscious Aunt Marie discloses a shocking truth. Nick is a Grimm, a descendant of a line of guardians with the unique ability to see the true forms of supernatural beings. For more answers, she instructs him to visit her trailer. Nick follows her advice and, upon arriving at the trailer, discovers a hidden world of ancient texts and unusual weaponry. His exploration is cut short when his girlfriend, Juliet, shows up unexpectedly, forcing him to quickly conceal the book and leave with her. The following day, Nick and Hank are assigned to a case involving a missing girl who was last seen heading to her grandparents' home. By tracing her path, they discover boot prints that guide them to a house where Nick sees a man transform into a wolf-like being. Convinced the man is the culprit, Nick attacks him. However, when backup arrives, they find no incriminating evidence. Later that evening, Nick stakes out the man's residence. The man, Monroe, eventually confronts Nick, but then surprisingly invites him in for a drink. He explains that he is a blutbod, a creature known in Nick's Grimm books as the Big Bad Wolf, and that Grimms have chronicled his kind for generations. As Nick struggles to process this new reality, he appeals to Monroe for assistance in locating the missing girl. Though reluctant, Monroe agrees and uses his blutbod senses to follow her scent. Their search leads them to a house where the girl is being held captive. Nick contacts Hank for backup, and together they confront the kidnapper, who poses as a postman. Initially, they find no solid evidence against him, but just as they are leaving, Hank recognizes a song from the girl's iPod. They re-enter the darkened house, where the kidnapper attacks. Hank is forced to shoot him, and as the man dies, he reverts to his human form and identifies Nick as a Grimm. A subsequent search of the house reveals the missing girl imprisoned in the basement. Later that night, while Nick is visiting Aunt Marie, the woman who transformed earlier reappears, attempting to inject Aunt Marie with a mysterious substance. In the ensuing struggle, Nick is accidentally injected instead and loses consciousness. The woman is later seen meeting with Captain Sean Renard, the head of the Portland Police Department, confirming their collaboration in a conspiracy against Nick and his aunt. The story shifts to a young couple, Rocky and Gilda, who break into a house while the owners are away. After helping themselves to food and beer, they move to the bedroom. Their intrusion is interrupted by the arrival of a car. As someone approaches the house, the panicked couple decides to make their escape through a window. Gilda jumps out successfully, but a monstrous being attacks Rocky just as he is about to follow, forcing Gilda to flee in terror. Nick later discovers from a doctor that his blood contains traces of PHTX-3, a neurotoxin commonly associated with spider bites. The doctor warns him to seek medical attention if he develops a fever. Nick and Hank attempt to identify the woman who attacked Nick using CCTV footage, but the image is too blurry. In the next scene, Gilda is at the police station reporting her boyfriend's disappearance. She takes Nick and Hank to the house where the incident occurred, where they are met by the homeowners, Frank and his wife, Diane, who are adamant that the trespassers be brought to justice. During the investigation, Nick observes a peculiar claw embedded in the glass. Nick later sees Aunt Marie at the hospital, where she explains that it is his duty to hunt down dangerous supernatural creatures, known as Weezin, continuing the legacy of his ancestors. She also cautions him about the Reapers, a secret society that recently targeted her, and stresses the importance of keeping the trailer a secret. Before she can elaborate, her condition deteriorates, and a nurse escorts Nick out of the room. Returning to the house, Nick and Hank question Barry, Frank's son. Nick catches a fleeting glimpse of Barry's face transforming into that of a bear. Nick then seeks out Monroe, who explains the claw belongs to a jagerbar, a bear-like Weezin, and is used during a coming-of-age ritual called Rohats, where they hunt prey at sundown. Meanwhile, an enraged Gilda, now armed, confronts Diane about Rocky's whereabouts. At that moment, Barry attacks her. Nick finds Frank and warns him of Barry's plan to kill Rocky as part of the ritual. They race to a cave, only to find that Rocky and Gilda have already escaped. In the surrounding jungle, Frank attempts to intervene, but Diane, the mother, inadvertently sets off one of Barry's traps and is critically wounded. Paramedics rush her to the hospital, while the police take Barry and his friends into custody. Later, at the hospital, Aunt Marie is attacked again. Nick rushes to her side, but is too late to save her, and she dies in his arms. The final shot shows Nick standing at her grave, unaware that a mysterious creature is observing him from the nearby bushes. Passengers are boarding a tram, among them a well-dressed woman and a man with an unusually large duffel bag. The atmosphere grows tense as the man reaches into his bag, but he pulls out a stereo instead of a weapon. The sounds of YMCA suddenly fill the air, and the entire tram car bursts into a surprise flash mob. While the driver and other commuters are left baffled, they discover the well-dressed woman dead on the floor after the tram empties at the next stop. Nick and Hank are called to the scene. The woman's body is severely swollen, prompting Sergeant Wu to speculate about anaphylactic shock. He also notes a recent local incident involving a dog attacked by a swarm of bees. Nick discovers a tiny puncture mark behind the victim's ear. Later, the medical examiner, Dr. Harper, confirms that the victim, Serena, died from a massive, lethal dose of bee venom, officially ruling it a homicide. At Serena's law firm, her colleagues and boss are stunned by the news of her death. Nick and Hank then seek information from a beekeeper about the venom. The beekeeper identifies it as artificially harvested but makes himself a suspect by offering an alibi before being asked for one. Tram surveillance footage offers few clues, but some witnesses from the flash mob agree to be questioned. One of them, Doug, behaves strangely and becomes evasive, refusing to let them see his phone. Under pressure, his face momentarily shifts into that of an insect-like weazen, confirming for Nick that this case is connected to the weazen world. Nick and Hank tail Doug to a derelict paper mill, where they witness him meeting with another man and a woman to exchange unknown items. Their surveillance is abruptly interrupted by a bee swarm, forcing the detectives to retreat. They later trace the mill's ownership to Melissa Wincroft, a woman whose company was ruined by a lawsuit handled by Serena and her firm. Nick realizes Melissa is a melifer, a bee-like weazen with the power to control bees, and that she is systematically targeting Serena's colleagues as an act of revenge. The final target, Ada Lynn Shade, is placed in protective custody. The situation grows complicated when Nick recognizes Ada Lynn as the hexsymbiote responsible for the attack on his aunt, creating an immediate and tense confrontation. Meanwhile, Melissa and the beekeeper locate them and use bees to corner Ada Lynn. Melissa insists to Nick that she is trying to shield him from a greater danger. During the final showdown, Melissa issues a cryptic warning about Nick's future as a Grimm. When she directs a threat toward Hank, Nick is forced to react, and Melissa is shot. In the aftermath, as Melissa succumbs to her injuries, her bee swarm mysteriously perishes with her. Her parting words about his destiny leave Nick deeply troubled. Back at his house, as he contemplates the recent events, a single bee appears and stings him, serving as a chilling reminder that the threat is far from over. A panicked woman shatters a glass window with her hand and flees into the darkness, pursued by unseen forces. As she races across a bridge, she is tormented by horrifying visions of a tentacled monster and a whirring saw blade. In her terror, she runs into the path of an oncoming car. The driver, Kent, gets out to offer aid, but a second man materializes and calmly tells him to call for help. The man then touches the woman's cheek, and in a disturbing moment, she asks him to kiss her before he proceeds to kill her. The next morning, detectives Nick and Hank are on the scene. Kent, who received treatment for minor injuries, describes the accident and the enigmatic man who vanished. Upon examining the woman's body, the detectives find strange injuries on her arms, indicating she was escaping something much more dangerous than a car. Elsewhere, a man checks into an empty hotel room with a briefcase. On a call, he vaguely promises someone he will let them know when it is done. A newspaper article detailing a prior confrontation between a Grimm and a Reaper is shown, revealing the Reaper's identity and foreshadowing a future conflict. Later, Dr. Harper tells Nick that the woman's death was not caused by the accident but by asphyxiation, suggesting foul play. Hank identifies the victim as Faith, who lived with her abusive husband, Roy. When questioned at his workplace, Roy denies any role in her death, stating they had an argument about her social media use the night before, after which she left. Though he lacks an alibi, Roy maintains he was at home waiting for her. The investigation leads Nick and Hank to a troubling social media post by Faith, which directs them to a bed and breakfast near the bridge. The proprietor, Billy, seems affable but is hiding a sinister secret. He is seen consuming a dead toad, confirming his weazen nature. The case grows darker as the detectives connect Billy to a string of disappearances involving women. They learn that in other cities, Women linked to him were found alive but pregnant, held in seclusion, and subjected to gas exposure. While surveilling Billy's home, Hank spots a recently mended window, likely where Faith injured herself. He hears cries from inside and discovers women held captive in cages just before gas is released. Nick enlists Monroe's help to track Billy, who is a weazen that uses a supernatural allure to manipulate his victims. Meanwhile, Captain Renard confronts the Reaper, slicing off his ear as a stark warning to stay away. Nick and Monroe find Billy's house and rescue Hank and the captive women from the gas-filled basement. Billy attempts to escape with another victim, sparking a dramatic pursuit. Although he is hit by a car, Billy uses his powers on a paramedic to create a diversion and flees. The final scene emphasizes that Billy, though his operation is exposed, remains a significant and ongoing danger. At a desolate dockyard, rats scurry over a dead bird. The silence is shattered by the booming music of a nearby rave, where the crowd roars for DJ Wretched Cat, who performs wearing a glowing pink cat mask, adding to the eerie atmosphere. In contrast, music teacher Paul Lawson is leading a lesson in a quiet classroom. He pauses the session to correct a student named Brimley for playing a wrong note. Later that evening, as Lawson is walking to his car, darkness descends, and a swarm of rats engulfs his vehicle, causing him to panic. The next morning, his body is found in the school parking lot by Assistant Principal Grace Kaplan, who immediately calls the police. Nick and Hank arrive, and Grace recounts her discovery. Sergeant Wu finds rat cages from Geiger Pest Control, which leads the detectives to Lawson's students, Carter, Sarah, Marvin, and Trey, all from wealthy families. During their interview, Carter points them toward Roddy Geiger, a former student who now works for his father's pest control company. At Geiger Pest Control, the detectives find Roddy playing the violin, surrounded by caged rats. When Nick introduces himself, Roddy's father, Geiger, briefly reveals his reinogen, rat-like weazen, form and becomes hostile. A scared Roddy flees, but Nick catches up and tries to gain his trust. Geiger claims Carter and his friends bullied Roddy and stole the rat cages. Roddy eventually confides in Nick about his love for the violin and the torment he endured. He admits to being DJ Wretched Cat but has a solid alibi, which Wu corroborates, being familiar with Roddy from the rave scene. The investigation determines that Lawson died of a heart attack induced by the rats, but the animals were not the direct cause. Fibers discovered in a rat's stomach are traced to a blanket from a luxury car, implicating Carter and his friends. The case takes another turn when Sarah's mother accuses Roddy of harassing her daughter, though her arrogant demeanor casts doubt on her story. Nick consults Monroe, who clarifies that reinogen are typically non-violent unless provoked. Nick and Hank soon learn that Carter, Trey, and Marvin had framed Roddy, leading to his expulsion. Fueled by a desire for revenge, Roddy uses his violin to command a rat swarm to a rave held in an abandoned warehouse. The wealthy students, unaware of the trap, attend the event and are soon overrun by rats. Sarah, torn between her friends and her feelings for Roddy, confronts Carter before following them inside. Nick and Hank get there just in time to de-escalate the crisis, scattering the rats and saving the students. Roddy, however, disappears, his future unknown. The episode concludes with Nick reflecting on how his Grimm identity seems to alienate Weazen, while Juliet silently copes with the mounting strain in their relationship, hinting at further complications. In a forest at night stands a geodome house. Inside, Hap Lasser is comically trying to balance his love of food with his fitness goals by using a vibrating exercise barbell. The device slips, shoots out of an open window, and lands outside. As Hap steps out to retrieve it, his house explodes. He is stunned but, remarkably, uninjured. The next morning, Nick and Hank are at the scene questioning Hap, who seems more concerned about losing his possessions, particularly his Xena, warrior princess comic. When Nick asks if he was building bombs, Hap becomes defensive, shifts into his Blutbad form, and vehemently denies it. He also brings up his brother Rolf, who perished in a similar explosion, suggesting a troubling pattern. At the police station, Hap reaches out to his old friend Monroe, asking for a place to stay. Nick presses Hap for any potential enemies, but Hap insists he is a friendly person who gets along with everyone, including those he owes money to. Monroe, Nick's Blutbad confidant, arrives and confesses that he knows Hap from a support group. Nick requests that Monroe keep an eye on Hap. Meanwhile, a shadowy biker inspects the explosion site, examining a severed gas line and a family photograph. Nick and Hank look into Hap's financial troubles and Rolf's death, but come up with no solid leads. Monroe brings Hap to his home, where Hap senses his friend's unease. Monroe tries to downplay it, but remains visibly tense. When Nick stops by Monroe's house, he is ambushed by a biker who is revealed to be Angie, Hap's sister and Monroe's ex-girlfriend. Angie is hostile toward Nick because he is a Grimm, but Monroe intervenes and diffuses the situation. She informs Nick that Hap named her as his life insurance beneficiary, making her a prime suspect. Angie provides an alibi, though Nick remains skeptical. That night, Monroe and Angie go for a blutbad run, reverting to their old, wild ways. The next morning, Monroe awakens in the woods next to Angie, horrified to find blood on their hands, evidence of a successful hunt. At the same time, Hap opens his door to an assassin disguised as a delivery person and is shot and killed. Nick, Hank, and Monroe investigate the murder and uncover a connection between Angie and Orson, a fire investigator who is also a Bauerschwein, a pig-like Weazen. Orson is driven by a desire for revenge, convinced that Angie murdered his brothers. In a tense confrontation, Nick faces off against Orson, but Angie appears and attacks the Bauerschwein. Nick fires at her, but she manages to get away. Ultimately, Orson is tied to multiple crimes, leaving Monroe shattered by Hap's death and his own fraught history with Angie. The final shot is of Monroe looking at a childhood photo of him and Angie sharing a kiss. A couple, Dustin and Lauren, are hiking in the woods when they inadvertently discover a hidden marijuana crop. They are captured by a gunman named Delmar, who leads them to his campsite. As Delmar is about to execute them, he is distracted by a sound from the forest. When he goes to investigate, he is attacked and killed by an unseen entity. A vine coils around his neck, strangling him while strange growls echo through the trees. Dustin and Lauren witness the terrifying event, paralyzed with fear. The following morning, Nick and Hank arrive with other officers and DEA agents to secure the drug farm. A DEA agent examines Delmar's body, remarking on his strangely twisted neck and noting that Delmar had been a target of their investigation for 3 years. Nick finds a single hair near the body, which is odd since Delmar was bald. Hank speculates that another person was involved. They also observe that Delmar's campsite was raided for supplies, but the drugs were ignored. Nick finds another hair near a snapped sapling and then briefly sees a supernatural figure, what appears to be a young blutbad, before the teenage girl flees deeper into the woods. Nick and Hank interview Dustin and Lauren, who recount their ordeal and describe how a mysterious attacker saved them. Meanwhile, Delmar's vengeful brothers, Randall and Micah, arrive in town seeking retribution. At the morgue, they inspect Delmar's body and angrily insist there is more to his death than the police are letting on. The investigation progresses when Nick and Hank find that the mysterious hair is a match to a 9-year-old cold case involving a missing girl named Holly Clark. Nick consults Monroe, who theorizes that Holly's latent blutbad instincts likely enabled her to survive alone in the wilderness. Unaware of her true identity, Holly has been living in the forest for years. Nick and Monroe venture into the woods and discover Holly's treehouse, where they find items she has scavenged for survival, including a trunk with the name Addison on it. Meanwhile, Hank and Wu research Holly's past and find evidence that points to her former neighbor, Jimmy Addison, as her kidnapper. When the team confronts Addison, his attempt to resist is quickly thwarted, confirming his guilt. Simultaneously, Randall and Micah abduct Dustin, convinced he knows who killed Delmar. Their search leads them to Holly's treehouse, where they mistake Monroe for their brother's killer. A violent struggle ensues. Holly uses her supernatural strength to subdue one brother, while Nick takes down the other. Though seriously injured, Holly's memory finally returns. She is reunited with her mother, who never gave up hope. A few days later, Captain Renard holds a press conference to announce Holly's recovery. Holly also positively identifies Addison as the man who abducted her 9 years prior. The episode closes with justice served as Addison is finally held responsible for his crimes. On a tense evening, Judge Logan Pattinson is in his luxurious study when the peace is violently shattered. An intruder smashes through the window and launches a savage assault on the judge. Displaying incredible strength and an apparent immunity to pain, the assailant withstands being shot and continues his brutal beating. Later, Sergeant Wu and his partner discover Judge Pattinson's deceased body at his residence. The attacker, subsequently identified as Stark, retreats to an isolated location to tend to his injuries. He casually extracts a bullet and discards his severed hand, which then miraculously regenerates, confirming that he is something other than human. Nick and Hank are summoned to the murder scene, where they are joined by Police Chief Renard. A key piece of evidence, a gavel with fingerprints, directs them to a second body, a man discovered with a severed hand and wearing a woman's timepiece. As their inquiry deepens, they begin to see a connection between the homicides. Nick seeks the expertise of Monroe, a friend with extensive knowledge of the Weazen world. Monroe observes that the watch is stopped at a specific time and date, a detail that directs their attention to Assistant District Attorney Mary Robinson. When they arrive to check on Mary, they find her dead. Her tongue has been removed and symbolically placed on a scale. Hank connects the dots. Judge Pattinson, Vince Chilton, and Mary Robinson were all key figures in convicting Stark for a murder years prior. Realizing he is the next intended victim, Hank agrees to be placed in protective custody. While Hank is under protection, Nick continues the investigation. Stark, in his pursuit of Hank, breaks into Nick's home and ambushes him. During the ensuing battle, a mutual recognition occurs. Nick identifies Stark as a Sigbarst, and Stark realizes Nick is a Grimm. Stark's immense power almost overcomes Nick, but Juliet saves him by dousing Stark with boiling water, forcing him to escape. Nick is grievously wounded and transported to the hospital. There, Monroe visits and clarifies that Sigbarst are virtually indestructible, except when faced with specific weapons. Fortuitously, Nick possesses such armaments in Aunt Marie's trailer. Monroe retrieves the necessary weapon from the trailer. Meanwhile, overcome with guilt for Nick's condition, Hank resolves to take matters into his own hands. He confesses to Nick that both he and Mary Robinson had suppressed evidence in Stark's original trial to guarantee a conviction. Determined to end the threat, Hank consents to setting a trap. In the final confrontation, Hank's firearm is useless against Stark's durability, but Monroe intervenes with the special weapon, killing Stark and saving Hank's life. In a high-stakes moment within a parking garage, a man in a red shirt confronts another individual, leveling an accusation against him. As the man in red gives chase deeper into the structure, he is distracted by a peculiar sound. When he turns, he is met by a horrifying figure that kills him during the struggle. In a startling development, the victim's body ages rapidly, appearing to be in his 70s before the assailant discards him in a dumpster. By the time a garbage truck collects the body in the morning, it has reverted to its youthful state. Detectives Nick, Hank, and Wu are brought in to investigate the bizarre homicide. The victim in the red shirt is identified as Drake. Their inquiry takes them to his apartment, where the landlord recalls a dispute involving Drake, his neighbor Mason, and his girlfriend, Natalie. They learn of Drake's history of domestic abuse and that Natalie fled the scene. When located, Natalie recounts how a downstairs neighbor named Marty attempted to intervene in the fight but departed when Mason arrived. She suspects Mason's involvement in Drake's death but concedes that Drake had numerous enemies. The investigation shifts its focus to Marty, a quiet and timid man who seems an unlikely candidate to confront Drake. However, Marty is revealed to be a Mozhertz, a docile, mouse-like weazen. Monroe, Nick's bloodbad companion, explains that Mozhertz are fundamentally peaceful, in stark contrast to Mason, who is a dangerous, snake-like weazen known as a lozengelange. Monroe cautions Nick that a confrontation between a Mozhertz and a lozengelange invariably ends poorly for the Mozhertz. At the same time, Juliet observes a man and a woman in an orange car photographing her. They speed away when she confronts them. She manages to track them down, only to find a terrified woman. The puzzle deepens when Monroe is assaulted during a clock repair call. He awakens to find a mysterious red scythe symbol painted on his vehicle. As the body count rises, Marty's suppressed rage towards Mason surfaces. Overwhelmed by his emotions and seeing his own abusive father in his reflections, Marty ends up killing Mason. He loses all control and flees through his warehouse with Nick and Hank in pursuit. Disoriented by a hall of mirrors, Marty allows Natalie to escape but is consumed by grief and guilt. Later, Nick visits Monroe, who clarifies that the scythe symbol is a threatening message from the Reapers. Despite Nick's concern, Monroe affirms his loyalty and his readiness to help him navigate the perils of the Weazen world. A frantic chase plays out in a forest as two young men, Stephen and Kevin, are hunted by grotesque creatures with pointed noses. Stephen, wounded, tumbles into a river while Kevin is captured. As Stephen's body is carried downstream, a crow starts pecking at his eyes. Back at home, Nick grapples with the burden of keeping his grim identity, a secret from his girlfriend, Juliet, and the potential danger it poses to her. His weazen friend, Monroe, advises against revealing the truth, arguing that humans cannot comprehend the existence of these creatures. Nick's attention is diverted when Stephen's body is discovered. The detectives find peculiar puncture wounds on his neck, indicating a greater blood loss than the river could account for. The coroner's report confirms that Stephen lost 7 pints of blood prior to drowning. The investigation brings them to a P.O. box registered in Stephen's name, but it proves to be a dead end. However, a young girl wearing a similar necklace points them toward Gracie, an acquaintance of Stephen. Devastated by the news, Gracie informs the detectives that she last saw him at a free clinic. At the clinic, the doctors maintain that Stephen was only treated for a spider bite, but the case takes a sinister turn when a man is apprehended while transporting human organs and blood. Nick and Hank delve into a perilous underworld, uncovering a human organ trafficking operation managed by the malevolent Dr. Levine. Monroe assists by going undercover to procure a human gallbladder on the black market. The blood from the transporter's accident matches Stephen's, leading Nick to suspect that street kids are being targeted. After Nick has dinner with Gracie and her brother Hanson, more missing children are found, culminating in a hazardous confrontation at a trailer used for drying human organs. The investigation climaxes in a violent shootout at a residence tied to the trafficking ring. Dr. Levine is confronted by Nick, but manages to escape into the woods, where she ultimately falls into a fire pit during the final struggle. Meanwhile, Renard is sent a chilling package containing a Reaper's ear, a clear sign that Nick's activities have attracted formidable adversaries. Inside an art gallery, a man named Ryan is on his phone. He spots a woman and approaches, offering to buy her a drink. She politely refuses, stating she needs to leave. As she departs, he follows and persuades her to accompany him to his apartment. Once there, he attempts to seduce her, but she grows uneasy and tries to exit. He then assaults her, but she transforms into a spider-like creature, spits a white substance into his mouth and kills him. She leaves afterward, and it's revealed that one of her fingers is severed. Nick and Hank arrive at the crime scene, where Sergeant Franco identifies the victim as Ryan and notes his Rolex watch is missing. While inspecting the body, Nick discovers a severed finger that starts to twitch. They transport the body to Dr. Harper, who determines that Ryan's internal organs were dissolved by a powerfully corrosive acid. At the police station, Sergeant Franco informs Nick and Hank of a strikingly similar case that occurred 5 years earlier in Phoenix. They review photos of that victim, whose condition is identical to Ryan's. Hank examines the toxicology report and finds spider venom in Ryan's system. Later that evening in his trailer, Nick discovers an illustration of a spider-like woman in one of his books. In a subsequent scene, the same woman who killed Ryan claims another victim in the same manner. The detectives analyze hotel surveillance footage and identify a blonde woman they suspect is the murderer. That night, Nick consults with Monroe, who identifies the creature as a spinetid, a spider-like weazen. Monroe admits his knowledge is limited but knows someone who can provide more information. The next scene shows the female killer at dinner with her family. She presents her husband with a Rolex watch, and they share a kiss. Monroe then introduces Nick to Charlotte, an older woman who explains that spinetids experience accelerated aging and must kill young men to drain their life essence and reverse the process. Back at the station, Hank informs Nick that Ryan's Rolex has been found. This clue leads them to Washington Middle School, where they speak with a young girl, Sally Marcinko, who claims she received the watch from her father. They proceed to Sally's home and arrest her father, John Oblinger. At the residence, Hank observes that Sally's mother, Lena, has an injured finger. When questioned, she claims she cut it in the kitchen, but it appears to have healed. At the station, Nick discovers that the severed finger from Ryan's body is a fingerprint match for Lena, exposing her as the killer. They race to her house, but she has already fled. Sergeant Franco reports that Lena's vehicle was located at River Place Marina. At the marina, Lena is aboard a boat with another man. Nick and Hank arrive, and Nick boards the vessel to search for her. Lena ambushes him, but Nick shoots at her, causing her to flee. He pursues her and successfully captures her in a fishing net. In the final scene, Lena is shown in a jail cell, her body beginning to age at an alarming rate. An elderly man is outside his home looking for his dog when a creature suddenly attacks him. He fights back, but in the process, ends up assaulting his wife, leading to both of their deaths. The creature then begins to consume them. At that moment, a group on horseback arrives, calling out the name Dimitri. The creature attempts to flee, but is quickly captured by the riders, who drag it away. The detectives and police arrive at the gruesome scene, where Sergeant Franco identifies the victims as Ed and Lois Weller. Ed was a retired lumber executive who had recently taken early retirement. As Nick and Hank survey the scene, they initially suspect an attack by a wild animal. Outside, they find numerous horse tracks, and Nick finds a saddle, which he takes as evidence. Hank later informs Nick that blood found at the scene matches a man named Dimitri Zakinthtos. Dimitri has a criminal history and was recently put on probation after a year in prison for selling cocaine. Hank also mentions that Dimitri's parole officer, Leo Tamor, is awaiting them at his office. At Leo's office, Nick and Hank inquire about Dimitri. Leo tells them that Dimitri is employed by his uncle at a boxing gym. They go to the gym and speak with Dimitri's uncle, Gus Pappas, who claims he hasn't seen Dimitri for weeks. Gus directs them to a man named Brian, who might have information. When Nick questions Brian, he learns that he last saw Dimitri several weeks ago at a party celebrating his parole. Brian leads Nick and Hank to Forest Park, a common jogging spot for Dimitri and others. While searching the park, Hank receives a call that Dimitri's abandoned vehicle has been found near a warehouse in Linton. At the warehouse, Nick sees a man and follows him inside. They discover a space spattered with blood, adorned with strange symbols and ancient weaponry, realizing it's being used as a fight club. Meanwhile, Captain Renard confronts Leo, warning him that these fights are escalating dangerously. He points out that Dimitri was not on the approved list of fighters and insists Leo prevent such an incident from reoccurring. Later, Nick visits the trailer and finds weapons that resemble those from the warehouse. Monroe arrives, and Nick questions him about the Lowen games. Monroe describes them as brutal, illegal competitions organized by lion-like weazen who revel in bloodshed. They abduct innocent individuals and compel them to fight to the death. Nick inquires if these games are still active. Monroe is uncertain but knows someone who might have more information. Monroe arranges a meeting with a man named Solly, who provides him an address with instructions to be there by 6 p.m. Monroe relays this to Nick and heads to the location. While on the phone with Nick, a horse trailer approaches Monroe. Nick urges him to flee, but he is attacked and kidnapped before he can react. Nick arrives at the abduction site and confronts a man in a car, forcing him to disclose Monroe's whereabouts. It is then revealed that Leo is the organizer of the fight club. Monroe is thrown into the ring to face a formidable opponent. Nick reaches the fight club and calls Hank for backup. Spotting Leo, Nick demands Monroe's freedom, but Leo retorts that the fights are to the death. Nick then offers to take Monroe's place in the fight. As the fight unfolds, Renard meets with a priest at a church to discuss Leo, urging the priest to end his activities. Back at the fight club, Hank arrives with police units, and they arrest everyone present. In the final scene, Renard confronts Leo, blaming him for the chaos and warning him of the repercussions. At that moment, a creature attacks and kills Leo. Inside a house, 3 men are preparing weapons for a robbery. Tensions escalate as 2 of them argue, revealing their weazen nature as shackle, which are jackal-like creatures. Their leader furiously intervenes, threatening them with death if they don't stop fighting. Their target is a jewelry store where the elderly owner, Samuel Bertram, is hiding in a walk-in safe. His priority is to secure a small box of coins above all else. When the robbers breach the safe, they find Bertram dead and the coins missing. Nick and Hank arrive to investigate. Hank reveals a personal connection, noting he once bought an engagement ring from the jeweler. Wu reports that only coins were taken, indicating the robbery was targeted. Meanwhile, the robbers become increasingly agitated upon realizing the coins are gone. The leader suspects the others of hiding them and resolves to go back to the store. Back at their hideout, the 2 remaining robbers are ambushed by a tall Stein Adler, an eagle-like creature. The Stein Adler expertly manipulates them into shooting one another. The leader, now the last one alive, returns to the jewelry store but fails to find the coins. Nick sees him transform into his shackle form and gives chase, but the robber gets away. Security footage captures the robber's vehicle, and Wu traces the license plate. At the hideout, the leader confronts the Stein Adler, who is revealed to be Farley Colt. The 2 have been hunting for the coins for years. Farley warns the leader of the coins' dangerous influence, explaining that they cause people to behave irrationally. During the autopsy, Harper discovers the missing coins on Bertram's body and observes a swastika on one. She is unable to explain Bertram's death, as gold alone should not have triggered such a reaction. Against Harper's advice, Hank takes the coins into his possession. Shortly after, the robber's car is located outside the house. Nick is concerned by Hank's uncharacteristic aggression, but they proceed with the investigation. Inside, they apprehend Farley, but the last robber escapes. Hank's behavior grows more erratic, and a patrolman is later found dead at the scene. At the police station, Farley cooperates with Nick, recounting the history of the coins of Zakinthtos. Forged in ancient Greece, the coins have passed through various empires, granting their owners immense charm and power while twisting their minds and corrupting them. Farley cautions Nick about their danger, stating that only Grimms can withstand their effects. He also alludes to a Grimm's murder 18 years prior and mentions a woman raising her nephew, implying a link to Nick's own family. Meanwhile, Renard, now in possession of the coins, falls under their influence and develops grandiose, unrealistic ambitions. Soledad Marquesa, the escaped robber, threatens Harper to find out the coins' location. Nick later uncovers Farley's connection to Aunt Marie, learning they were once engaged and that Farley was involved in the circumstances of Nick's parents' deaths. In a tense confrontation, Nick, Hank, and Farley face off against Marquesa as he attempts to attack Renard. Marquesa is killed before he can reveal more about Nick's past. Farley escapes but is later confronted by Nick in his hotel room. After a struggle, Nick secures the coins, fully aware of their danger. He locks them safely in the weapons cabinet in his trailer. The episode concludes with a film reel found among Farley's possessions, depicting Adolf Hitler as a weazen, his influence magnified by the coin during his speeches. 2 thieves break into a factory to steal copper, only to find that someone has already taken it. While searching the premises, they are attacked and incinerated by a dragon-like weazen known as a demon viewer. Soon after, a severely burned man staggers from the scene and escapes on a rail rail cart. The following morning, Nick and Hank are at the factory with arson investigator Jort. The thieves' bodies were burned by a substance resembling napalm, yet no accelerant was detected. The factory owner, Truman, reports that his copper has been stolen in several break-ins and that security measures have been ineffective. Nick observes that the lock on the factory door appears melted, and Hank finds an oily substance on the ground, later identified as containing human lipids. Wu provides a witness account of a burned man fleeing the scene, giving the investigation a lead. The burned man is identified as Fred Eberhardt, a Desert Storm veteran and a demon viewer. Fred later attacks Truman but flees when the police show up. During this encounter, Fred sprays Wu with his fiery, ketonic substance but refrains from killing him. Nick and Hank deduce that Fred is not just dangerous but also a tragic figure, as his human form looks sickly and pained. Nick traces Fred's daughter, Ariel, to a nightclub where she is a fire dancer. Ariel, who is also a demon viewer, instantly identifies Nick as a Grimm. She taunts him and refuses to disclose her father's location. By following her, Nick finds her home, which is filled with copper fixtures and evidence of fire purging. Ariel provocatively kisses him, but their moment is cut short by a call from Juliet, creating friction between Nick and his girlfriend. Research reveals that demon viewer are descended from dragons, and their lairs are typically filled with copper and bones. Ariel later sets a trap for Nick by abducting Juliet and taking her to the lair to aid her dying father. Ariel deceives Fred, convincing him that Juliet is his mate and compelling him to protect her. Nick enlists Monroe's help to rescue Juliet, and the pair heads to the lair. Monroe frees Juliet while Nick confronts Fred. In the ensuing fight, Nick is forced to kill Fred in self-defense. Ariel survives the confrontation and emerges from the lair, enraged but alive. The episode concludes with unresolved tension. The relationship between Nick and Juliet is strained, with Juliet questioning her ability to cope with the dangers of Nick's life. Nick contemplates his Aunt Marie's warning to let Juliet go, leaving him uncertain about their future. Renard instructs Adelind to cast a love spell on Hank as a component of his scheme to manipulate Nick. Despite her reluctance, Adelind complies, using a vial of blood from Renard to create the spell. Meanwhile, Juliet, still shaken by recent events, asks Nick for shooting lessons. Their discussion is interrupted by a flustered refrigerator repairman who awkwardly apologizes for spreading rumors that Nick is a Grimm. He presents a gift as an apology, which Juliet finds amusing, though Nick dismisses it with a fabricated story. Elsewhere, two Weazen addicts consume a drug called J, which inflates their confidence and makes them hostile. Under the influence of J, they burst into a spice shop owned by Freddy, a Fusebow. After Adelind completes her purchase and leaves, the addicts demand more J from Freddy. Feeling pressured, Freddy sends them to the basement, but triggers an alarm to frighten them off. As the addicts escape with the drug, one of them shoots and kills Freddy. Nick and Hank are assigned the case, and Nick contacts Freddy's sister, Rosalie, to deliver the devastating news. Rosalie, initially maintaining her composure, agrees to meet Nick at the shop. Upon seeing the crime scene, she is overcome with grief and involuntarily shifts into her Weazen form, revealing her true nature to Nick. Although distrustful of him as a Grimm, Rosalie chooses to assist in the investigation, offering to identify what the addicts had stolen. Adelind makes a stop at Hank's place, offering him cookies that have been infused with a love spell. Not realizing the cookies are enchanted, Hank consumes them, activating the potion's power. Over at the spice shop, Monroe assists Nick by identifying J as a particularly dangerous and habit-forming drug. A bond begins to form between Rosalie and Monroe, rooted in their shared Weazen identity, and Rosalie voices her determination to find the individuals who murdered her brother. Later that night, the same addicts break into the shop once more, sending Rosalie into hiding. After successfully escaping, she contacts Nick and identifies her assailants as Scalenject. Citing a preference for Weazen-based protection, she requests Monroe's assistance rather than getting human law enforcement involved. Meanwhile, the spell cast on Hank starts to manifest as he experiences powerful hallucinations of Adelind. The following day, Rosalie and Monroe find themselves growing closer as they collaborate at the shop. Nick and Hank manage to locate the addicts, but Hank becomes sidetracked by his visions of Adelind, which gives the suspects an opportunity to get away. Sometime later, Monroe and Rosalie come to the aid of Wu, who has a severe allergic reaction after accidentally ingesting a hazardous substance from the shop. Rosalie is able to concoct an antidote swiftly, and in the process, she opens up about her own past battles with addiction. With Rosalie's guidance, Nick and Monroe conduct a raid on a Weazen crack house, successfully apprehending the addicts. Monroe, thankful for her help, offers to support Rosalie in her decision to keep her late brother's spice shop operating for the time being. The episode concludes with Juliet showcasing impressive skills at the gun gun range, leaving Nick impressed, while Hank has obsessive dreams about Adalind, signaling the love spell's tightening grip. At the police precinct, Nick queries Hank about his methods for staying organized and making sure tasks are completed. He then confides in Hank, revealing his plan to propose to Juliet on their upcoming weekend trip, but he also expresses his fear that she might decline. Hank deflects Nick's concerns, and Nick's own reasons for proposing are not entirely clear, given the recent strain on their relationship. In a nearby forest close to Whispering Pines, their destination, a weazen known as a Selen Vogle named Robin is in hiding. She is attempting to flee from Tim, a clawstrike who subjects her to control and abuse. Back at the station, Hank, still influenced by Adalind's spell, uses police databases to obsessively keep tabs on her. Wu, also suffering from the spell's aftereffects, starts exhibiting odd behavior, such as consuming paper clips. Upon arriving at their cabin, Nick and Juliet stop at Robin's house to ask for directions. Nick senses Tim's hostility and observes his weazen transformation when he answers the door. Juliet is likewise disturbed by Robin's frightened demeanor. A short time later, Juliet sees Tim violently drag Robin back into the house, prompting Nick to call the local sheriff. They are unaware that the sheriff is Tim's cousin and complicit in the abuse. Inside, Tim is forcing Robin to consume a peculiar concoction designed to make her produce a priceless golden egg in her throat, a characteristic unique to Selen Vogle Weazen. Back in the city, Hank's obsession with Adalind escalates. He begins stalking her and even threatens a man visiting her apartment. In the meantime, Nick consults with Monroe and Rosalie, who shed light on the extreme rarity of Robin's Weazen type and the extraordinary value of the golden egg. They issue a stark warning. Once Tim takes the egg, Robin will be of no further value to him. At Whispering Pines, Nick and Juliet witness Robin attempting to escape after having drugged Tim's tea. Nick pursues her into the woods, but is too late to prevent Tim from catching her and pulling her back inside. When Nick intervenes, he manages to rescue Robin and bring her to his cabin, where she exposes the sheriff's involvement. It isn't long before Tim and the sheriff storm the cabin, compelling Robin to flee into the forest. Nick gives chase while Juliet takes cover. Deep in the woods, Robin collapses as she starts to expel the egg. Guided by Rosalie and Monroe over a FaceTime call, Nick performs an impromptu procedure to extract the golden egg safely. Tim and the sheriff show up, demanding the egg. Nick creates a diversion by tossing the egg into the air, allowing him to subdue the sheriff as Tim makes a run for it. During the pursuit, Tim stumbles, and the egg falls and shatters, leaving him utterly devastated as Nick places him under arrest. Returning home, Nick finally proposes to Juliet. She turns him down, however, explaining that his emotional distance and secrecy are the reasons. In another part of town, Hank has a date with Adalind, and the spell's hold on him intensifies. Inside his trailer, Nick is trying to find what the enigmatic key might unlock. In a moment of frustration, he accidentally knocks over an ink bottle, and when he presses the ink-stained key to a piece of paper, he discovers hidden engravings. At the same time, Captain Renard is held at gunpoint by Woolsey, a man working for his cousin, Anton. He is taken to an abandoned building where Anton demands he surrender the key, warning Renard that their family will use force to get it. Renard fights back, killing both Anton and Woolsey and thereby asserting his dominance over the situation. Later, Nick and Juliet arrive for a double dinner date, and Nick is shocked to discover that Hank's date is Adalind. Adalind acts the part of the perfect girlfriend, charming Juliet, as Nick struggles to conceal his agitation. When Adalind steps away to answer her phone, Nick follows her and warns her to leave Hank alone. She scoffs at his concerns, maintaining that her feelings for Hank are real. Following their tense conversation, Nick vents his anger, only to be interrupted by Hank, who calls with news of a new crime scene. Elsewhere, Renard pays a visit to Catherine, Adalind's mother, who asks if her own debts will be forgiven once Adalind's scheme is successful. Renard assures her that those who are helpful will be rewarded, but also warns her of the consequences of failure. In the meantime, Hank's behavior becomes increasingly obsessive due to Adalind's spell, and Wu continues to eat non-edible objects as a side effect of his earlier exposure to a potion. At the crime scene, Nick and Hank discover the bodies of Anton and Woolsey. Nick believes a third individual was present, but Renard appears unconcerned when they present their findings. Later, Renard covertly tampers with the evidence, swapping the SIM card from a cell phone found at the scene to remove any link to his involvement. Nick's concern over Adalind's influence on Hank deepens, leading him to speak with Monroe and Rosalie. They suspect a potion is the cause, identifying it as death for love, a lethal brew that induces obsessive behavior before it ultimately kills the victim. Rosalie begins formulating an antidote but cautions that if Hank and Adalind have been intimate, breaking the spell will be almost impossible. By the time Nick attempts to warn Hank, it is too late. Hank and Adalind have already spent the night together. Shortly after, Adalind calls Nick and demands the key in return for Hank's life. Rosalie informs him that the only way to sever a blood-based spell is with the blood of a Grimm. During a meeting in a park, Nick confronts Adelind, provoking her until she attacks him. In the ensuing struggle, she accidentally ingests some of his blood, which shatters the spell. The curse on Hank is immediately lifted, but as a consequence, Adelind loses her Hexenbeast abilities, becoming fully human. Feeling utterly defeated, she flees. At her mother's home, Catherine and Renard berate Adelind for her failure. Renard comments that Nick's intelligence could prove useful to their cause. Meanwhile, Nick deciphers the engravings on the key, realizing they form part of a map. He spends the night in Aunt Marie's trailer, documenting his encounters with Weazen like Tim, the Clawstrike, and Claire in the Grimm diaries. Despite his exhaustion, he continues writing, reflecting on his recent experiences. Concurrently, in Washington, a Weazen on the run transforms to conceal himself, narrowly avoiding a pursuer. A second Weazen arrives moments later, sniffing the air and continuing the chase. A CIA logo visible on a nearby pillar suggests a larger conspiracy. In St. Louis, the fleeing Weazen, Ian Harmon, makes arrangements to catch a bus to Portland. A tracker smashes into his room, and Ian is forced to kill him in self-defense. Before he dies, Ian spots a tattoo on the tracker's hand, 2 interlocked diamonds. The next day, another tracker discovers Ian's note and follows his trail to Portland. At a bus station, Ian barely escapes another assault, but he is wounded and loses his backpack in the process. Back in Portland, Renard arrives home to find the new tracker, Edgar, awaiting him. Edgar reveals he works for the Ferrot, an organization with ties to the 7 royal families, and is hunting Ian, a resistance leader. He coerces Renard into assisting him, threatening repercussions if he declines. Renard, resentful of Edgar's authority, reluctantly agrees to cooperate. The next morning, a clear-headed Hank picks Nick up for work. Hank expresses relief that his relationship with Adelind is finished and comments on how bizarre it was to wake up with Rosalie and Monroe in his room. They head to a shooting at the bus depot, where Wu provides details, including a witness's description of Ian's backpack. At the spice shop, Ian seeks refuge with Rosalie. She initially attacks him before recognizing him as a former lover and a prominent figure in the resistance. Despite his injuries, Ian refuses medical attention from a hospital, fearing the Ferrot will find him. Rosalie contacts Monroe for assistance, and they work together to remove the bullet. Monroe feels uneasy about Ian's history with Rosalie and the implications of his arrival for the Ferrot's escalating presence in Portland. Nick and Hank's investigation at the bus depot leads them to connect Ian with the murder of a bartender, unaware that Edgar orchestrated the crime to frame Ian. Meanwhile, Edgar blackmails a camera store owner, Reginald, into betraying Ian. When Rosalie visits the store to procure new identity papers for Ian, Reginald alerts Edgar, which results in Reginald's murder. Edgar then decides to use Rosalie as bait to draw out Monroe and Ian. At the spice shop, Edgar holds Rosalie at gunpoint, threatening her life unless Ian surrenders. Monroe arrives with Ian, closely followed by Nick, who creates a diversion. Rosalie seizes the opportunity to disable Edgar with a Weazen powder, and Monroe, in his Blutbad form, overpowers him. Ian, knowing the Ferrot will never cease their hunt, kills Edgar against Nick's objections. To shield Rosalie and Monroe, Nick stages Ian's arrest, but secretly sets him free at the bus depot. Later, while examining Edgar's body, Renard warns Nick that Ian's chances of survival are slim, as the world is on the verge of a war engineered by the 7 royal families. Nick inspects the weapons in his trailer's cabinet, feeling overwhelmed by their lethal capabilities. Determined to enhance his fighting skills, he arranges a training session with Monroe in the woods. During their practice, Monroe good-naturedly teases Nick about his limited knowledge of his own Grimm powers, but the session also serves as a bonding experience for them. In another part of the city, at a construction site beneath a bridge, an IceBiber named Robert refuses to pay protection money to Sal, a Haslich Weazen. In an act of retaliation, Sal drowns Robert in a cement vat. A construction worker, Arnold, witnesses the murder and barely escapes after Sal notices him. That night, Arnold seeks shelter with a fellow IceBiber, John, and recounts what he saw. Arnold, however, is too terrified to go to the police, fearing Sal's retribution and the Haslich's grip on their community. The following morning, Nick and Hank investigate Robert's death. They trace the 911 call back to Arnold, but discover his home is empty. Nick recognizes Arnold from a photograph with Bud, the refrigerator repairman, and another IceBiber he has previously met. Nick visits Bud, who explains that the IceBibers typically pay the Haslich to prevent trouble, and warns that Sal has control over all bridge construction projects in Portland. Bud offers to help Nick locate Arnold. At home, Juliet insists that Nick invite Monroe over for dinner as a way to thank him for saving her life. Monroe is both excited and anxious, as he and Nick cannot cannot explain their friendship without revealing the world of Weezin. Throughout the dinner, they attempt to create a cover story by mixing truths with fabrications, leaving Juliet slightly confused but charmed by Monroe's personality. Meanwhile, Bud persuades Arnold to present his case to the IceBiber Lodge, where the community will vote on whether he should testify. Despite Bud's passionate plea and Nick's encouragement, the Lodge votes against it, fearing violent reprisals from the Hasslich. A disappointed Nick departs, but not before thanking Bud for his efforts. Later, moved by Bud's courage, Arnold has a change of heart and turns himself in at the station. Upon learning of Arnold's decision, Sal makes contact with two Reapers, lethal enforcers who specialize in hunting Grimms. The Reapers coerce Sal into luring Nick to his club, but Sal is apprehended before the plan can be executed. As Nick is driving Arnold to a safe house, the Reapers ambush them. Bud and John manage to warn Nick, who leads the Reapers to an isolated location. Wielding his Grimm armaments, Nick battles the Reapers, killing one and accidentally decapitating the other in the process. He then uses a hemlock-tipped arrow to neutralize the second Reaper. Nick calls Monroe for help, and they dispose of the bodies together. To send a clear message, they pack the severed heads in a box and ship them to Germany with a note stating, "Next time, send your best." In Mannheim, a senior Reaper receives the package and understands that Nick is far from an ordinary Grimm. When Nick returns home, he finds his living room filled with pies, quilts, and flowers, a collective thank you from the IceBiber community for his actions against Sal. Touched by the gesture, Nick downplays his role, insisting he was just doing his job, while Juliet observes with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Images are shown of Arthur and Lucinda, a happy couple on their wedding day. Their situation sours dramatically when Arthur loses his fortune after an investor named Atticus defrauds him. In desperation, he first asks Spencer, his wife's godfather, for help and later approaches Lucinda's stepmother, Mavis, for a loan, but she turns him down. Tensions escalate when Spencer reveals himself to be a bat-like Weezin, a mercile. Shortly thereafter, Mavis is discovered dead at the foot of her stairs, her body bearing wounds consistent with an animal attack. Nick, still troubled by the circumstances of his parents' deaths, discusses the case with Juliet and resolves to investigate further. The next morning, Mavis's daughters, Tiffany and Taylor, find their mother's body. The investigation finds no signs of forced entry, but shattered glass and blood indicate a violent struggle. Mavis had recently discussed Arthur's financial woes and harbored suspicions about him. Spencer is also a person of interest, as Mavis had always disliked him despite his long-term affiliation with the family. Juliet gets in touch with Arnold Gubser, a detective who worked on Nick's parents' case, seeking more information about an incident initially ruled an accident but later reclassified as a homicide involving 4 suspects, 3 of whom Nick recognizes. Meanwhile, Nick and Hank question Arthur and Lucinda but uncover no solid evidence connecting them to Mavis's death. The case takes a sharp turn when Spencer transforms into his bat form, confirming his Weezin nature. Arthur and Lucinda maintain their innocence, but the atmosphere grows more fraught. As the investigation progresses, Lucinda, who appeared blameless at first, confesses that Spencer has been her protector for many years. Spencer admits to his obsession with Lucinda and confesses to killing both Mavis and Tiffany, claiming they mistreated her. Simultaneously, Nick and Monroe utilize a siren to counteract Spencer's high-frequency sonic attacks, a tactic they learned about from Monroe's research on mercile Weezin. Spencer confesses to Nick and Hank, but it becomes clear his real strategy is to use the confession to plead insanity. Spencer further manipulates events by warning Nick about Lucinda, asserting she will inherit everything after her sister, Taylor, is also dead. Nick and Hank race to protect Taylor, but they are too late. Lucinda, also in her bat form, kills Taylor before they can stop her. As Lucinda attempts her escape, Nick and Monroe use the siren to corner her, but the surrounding glass shatters, enabling her to flee. In a final confrontation, Lucinda is killed by Spencer, who then dies at her hands. Nick comes to the realization that the siren itself was the murder weapon, a conclusion with which Renard concurs. Back at home, Nick processes the events with Juliet, who apologizes for bringing up painful memories, and he reassures her. The episode concludes with Nick gazing at a photo of the last remaining suspect in his parents' murder. 2 young boys, David Gimlin and Michael Patterson, are trekking through a jungle in search of Bigfoot when they are suddenly attacked and killed. In the following scene, a man named Tom discovers a wounded horse outside his home. He calls Juliet, asking her to come and treat the injured animal. After examining the horse's wounds, Juliet speculates that a large animal was responsible for the attack. The 2 of them venture toward the jungle, where they find the boys' dead bodies. Juliet calls Nick to inform him that she has discovered a body. Nick arrives at the crime scene with Hank and other officers, where they recover a camera. A young girl emerges from the foliage, crying, and claims that Bigfoot killed the boys. Upon reviewing the camera's footage, they see that the assailant is wearing a red shirt. Monroe is at home asleep when a noise from downstairs awakens him. He goes to investigate and finds his old friend, Larry Mackenzie, who reveals himself to be a Wilderman. Larry is severely injured, prompting Monroe to immediately call Nick and ask him to come over. Nick arrives promptly. Monroe vouches for Larry, stating he is a gentle person and incapable of murder. He informs Nick that Larry had been participating in therapy sessions with Konstantin Brinkerhoff, a therapist who caters to Wiesen. During their conversation, Monroe picks up the scent of search dogs approaching his house. To create a diversion, Monroe puts on Larry's shirt and dashes into the jungle. As he transforms into his Wiesen form, the dogs become terrified and retreat. In his blutbad state, Monroe runs into Hank, who is startled by the sight. Monroe returns home just as Larry begins to behave erratically. He pulls a pump-like device from his neck, his breathing ceases, and he dies. Nick and Monroe carry Larry's body and the pump into the jungle. In a later scene, Nick confronts Brinkerhoff to inquire about Larry. Brinkerhoff explains that Larry had been dealing with issues of impulse control. Nick then receives a call from Hank, who reports that they have located the killer's body in the jungle. An inspector discovers a pump with a serial number on it, and Nick instructs him to trace the manufacturer. Meanwhile, Juliet analyzes the injured horse's hair at her lab. Renard announces to the media that the killer's body has been found and the public is no longer in danger. Later that night, two men are drinking beer when one walks away to relieve himself. A man named Alan Evercroft attacks and kills him, then turns on the second man. However, the second man manages to stab and kill Alan with a metal rod. The next morning, Nick and Hank arrive at the new crime scene to investigate. They observe that the victim's injuries match those found on Larry's body. At the same time, Monroe meets with an old friend who discloses that Larry, along with Alan Evercroft and another man named Dan Murray, had all been patients of Brinkerhoff. Monroe relays this information to Nick, who tells him that Alan Evercroft was killed the previous night. He adds that Evercroft had the same type of pump in his body as Larry. Monroe's attempt to contact Dan Murray is answered by his brother, who says Dan died 2 days prior after falling from a window. At the station, Wu informs them that Dr. Brinkerhoff had ordered these specific pumps 3 months ago. Dr. Brinkerhoff is in his office when Monroe confronts him, demanding to know what drugs he has been administering to his patients. Brinkerhoff becomes enraged and attacks Monroe. As the police arrive, Brinkerhoff smashes a window and escapes. He flees into a theater, with Nick and Hank in pursuit. Brinkerhoff attempts to ambush Nick from behind, but Hank fires his weapon, saving Nick's life. Brinkerhoff falls, and when Hank approaches to check on him, he witnesses Brinkerhoff's face morph. Hank is profoundly shocked by what he sees. In the final scene, Nick is with Juliet, who tells him the test results on the horse's hair were inconclusive. She notes that the DNA does not correspond to any known species, and admits that she is beginning to entertain the possibility of things like Bigfoot. In a restaurant, Nick and Monroe are discussing Hank's mental state. Nick mentions that Hank is still reeling from what he witnessed. Monroe adds that Hank was terrified when he saw him in his blutbad form. As they exit the restaurant, a man named Nathaniel Adam photographs them. He makes a phone call, stating that it's time for him to visit Portland. At the station, Hank asks Nick what he is working on. Nick explains that Interpol has forwarded a file on Akira Kimura, one of the individuals responsible for his parents' deaths. He elaborates that Kimura sold the gold coins to Sam Bertram. In the next scene, Akira Kimura lands in Portland and is greeted by Adam. He informs Kimura that Marchesa was implicated in a jewelry store robbery that resulted in the death of the owner, Sam Bertram. 3 gold coins were discovered in Bertram's stomach during the autopsy. Adam provides Kimura with photos of Nick and Hank, identifying them as the detectives on the case. After acquiring all the necessary information, Kimura kills Adam. Meanwhile, Adalind brings her cat to Juliet's veterinary clinic, where the cat attacks Juliet. It is later revealed that Adalind has placed a spell on the cat. Nick and Hank arrive at a crime scene where they find a coat containing only a car key. A search of the vehicle uncovers a camera with photos of them on it. Captain Renard returns to his apartment to find it has been ransacked. In the kitchen, he discovers the body of his maid. At that moment, Kimura ambushes him and takes him hostage, demanding the location of the coins, but Renard claims ignorance. Nick, Hank, and other officers arrive, forcing Kimura to flee. Nick explains to Renard that Kimura is associated with a clandestine organization called Dragon's Tongue, founded in 1901. Nick then goes to Monroe's house to tell him about Kimura and the photos found on his private investigator's camera. That night, while Nick is with Juliet, she shows him a bandaged scratch on her hand from Adelind's cat. Nick urges her to go to the hospital immediately, explaining explaining that Adelind is not an ordinary person. Confused by his warning, Nick takes Juliet to Aunt Marie's trailer. There, he shows her the books and weapons and explains his ability to see people's true forms. Juliet becomes convinced that Nick is having a mental breakdown and suggests he seek psychiatric help. In a desperate attempt to prove he is telling the truth, Nick takes her to Monroe's house and asks Monroe to transform into his bloodbod form for her. Before Monroe can change, Juliet faints, and Nick rushes her to the hospital. Meanwhile, at Adam's residence, a woman photographs Nick before leaving the room. Inspector Wu spots her and orders her to stop, but she attacks Wu and the other officers before making her escape. At the hospital, Monroe tells Nick that to help Juliet, they must find the cat that scratched her. They successfully track down Adelind's cat and bring it to Rosalie, asking her to devise a cure for Juliet. When Nick arrives home, he finds the house in disarray. He then sees Kimura descending the stairs. Nick opens fire on Kimura, and a fierce fight ensues. Just then, the woman from Adam's place arrives and kills Kimura. In the final moment of the season, Nick looks at her and says, "Mom," and that wraps up season 1 of Grimm. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button. And if the hype option is showing beside the comment section, make sure to hype this video and show your support. Thanks for watching.